I often say, like, a professor can tell you how we got here, a practitioner tells you where we are. We used to, we started saying the week is more important than the weekend. Well, that was a reaction to the weekend is all that matters.
Right.
The problem is when you start saying something enough, people start believing it, and they don't realize that the weekend is vitally important. The missiologists that were really trying to get drilled down on disciple-making mission, every member a missionary, they got the mic for 20 years.
Right.
And now what you have, so much so that you don't have one class in a seminary that simply says 5 ways to grow your church.
Right.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right, hello Internet. My name is Pastor Bobby Herrington, and this is Pastor Andrew Hopper with me. And today we are launching the Breaking Barriers podcast. We have been very excited about this for a really long time. I know for me, as soon as I say the words, we're launching a podcast, because I listen to dozens and dozens of podcasts. There must be millions of podcasts out there. I sort of immediately have the question, why in the world another podcast? And so I'm going to let Pastor Andrew talk a little bit about that and really what this is going to be all about and what Breaking Barriers is all about.
Yeah, I think for us, man, Breaking Barriers, the podcast component of it is really about helping churches break free of sort of this tyrannical grip that the anti-church growth movement has over their thinking and over their practices. Man, we really want to be the type of church and movement, really, this is ministries coming out of a church, but we really want to be the type of movement ministry church that believes in what Jesus said in Luke 12, that to whom much is given, much is required. And I think right now we see a vital need for a lane for churches that don't want to feel guilty about going after growth because they are connecting it to our ultimate mission, which is to make disciples and multiply churches, all around the world. And that's just something that I think right now is lost. You have churches that want to divorce the concept of church growth from the concept of disciple making. I think you see it ultimately in this concept of we celebrate disciple making, we demonize growth. We don't want to talk about numbers, but we want to talk about the stories of one-on-one life change. Or the way we've been saying it is, you want to celebrate sending, but you want to demonize growing. And I think it's crazy. I think it's very simply just a misunderstanding of leads and lags. That we need to understand church growth happens really as and before disciple making and sending can happen. Demonizing church growth but celebrating sending is the same as celebrating generosity while you're demonizing financial success. It makes no sense because one of them leads to the other. And we've personally seen dozens of aha moments where people kind of understand and get freed from sort of the cultural waters that we're in terms of, demonizing growth. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So we're calling this Breaking Barriers, and the vision and the goal really is to help pastors, help church leaders break through the barriers they put on themselves in terms of, I don't believe God can do this. I'm afraid. Is God ever going to work through my church? Those sort of barriers. And then there's also just the barriers that you're kind of talking about that, you said, I don't know if it's a real thing or not, but like anti-church growth movement, like the barrier that somebody else would put on us to say, it's wrong for you, pastor, to want your church to grow.
Right.
Something's wrong with your character. Something's wrong with you. So that's what Breaking Barriers is all about, helping us to kind of break through those barriers that others are putting on us. And then the ones that obviously we would put on ourselves. And, just kind of when we think about this, like, why do you think that, this whole anti-church growth, all this stuff, like, how have we gotten to kind of this point,
Yeah, I mean, I often say like a professor can tell you how we got here, a practitioner tells you where we are. I mean, you and I are both practitioners. So, I mean, tracing it exactly to how we got here, I mean, I don't know that anybody could really do that. I could try. I mean, what I would probably say is, I mean, I started ministry, we've been here for 10 or 12 years. We were at the Summit Church for 5 years before that. Feels like where we were was the pendulum was kind of starting to swing towards missional, disciple-making, sending, because it was coming out of a church growth lane. You think about purpose-driven and all these conferences and, Saddleback, and you think about, just all the stuff that was coming with, different conferences and all that. And it's like, the reaction to that was sending missional disciple. Well, the problem is we said a lot of things in that, reaction that were true, but now people begin to believe them in a way that I don't think we ever intended, which, like, for example, we used to, we started saying the week is more important than the weekend. Well, that was a reaction to the weekend is all that matters.
Right.
The problem is when you start saying something enough, people start believing it, and they don't realize that the weekend is vitally important. That without the weekend, the weekend fuels what happens in discipleship during the week. You can't divorce them. I think we overstate things many times trying to be prophetic and moving the movement. The problem is you get a few years down the road. So, for example, we used to say a lot, sending capacity is more important than seating capacity, which, I mean, that's fine. That's like saying the resurrection, though, is more important than Christmas. It's like, yeah, okay, I can go with you. The resurrection's more important than Christmas. But, I mean, guys, without Christmas, there ain't no resurrection, So we have tried. I think that maybe some of that is how we've gotten here. The missiologists that were really trying to get drilled down on disciple making, mission, every member a missionary, they got the mic for 20 years.
Right.
And now what you have, so much so that you don't have one class in a seminary that simply says 5 ways to grow your church.
Right.
You can have an entire conference in our denomination that has 45 breakouts on everything you can imagine. Diversity, one-on-one evangelism, how to do a mission trip, how to adopt kids, and there will not be one breakout on how to, 20 ways to grow your church by 20% would be demonized, it would be laughing stock.
You would think, like leading up to this podcast, I just started, because I personally love podcasts. So all types of podcasts, running, finance, church, economics, all the different stuff. And so, I just went into podcast search and just put church growth. You just would think, man, there's probably tons of podcasts out there where pastors are talking about how to grow your church and why it's important to grow your church. There's shockingly few people that are talking specifically about church growth. I mean, there's a pastor and his diet, pastor and his love life, pastor and his family. I mean, every topic you could think of.
I'm gonna listen to that one on love life
in terms of ministry. But there's just not a lot of man. The funny thing is you have some podcasts that are led by super big names in the Christian world that actually have seen a lot of growth in their churches in some pretty incredible ways. But even some of those podcasts are telling you why you shouldn't desire.
Yeah, exactly.
Why you shouldn't desire for your church to grow.
And the ironic thing is, all of those churches are doing a lot of the same things, but but those things that they do, they call them backstage conversations. Mm-hmm. The front of stage conversation needs to be about all the stuff I mentioned: adoption, diversity, one-on-one evangelism, missional, whatever. The backstage conversation is 90% of everything they do is geared around how to get and retain first-time guests. Mm-hmm. But they don't talk about that. And, I think that in an effort to try to get people not to only focus on that, they have said, we're not going to focus on it at all. And so it's, you say, why are we launching this podcast? I mean, I have a deep burden for this because I look around and here's what I see. And I'm an analytical guy. You are too. All right. We are in a denomination, the largest evangelical denomination in the States. Okay. In this denomination, it is currently widely purported that 80% of the churches are plateaued and declining. We have got to be the only movement in the world that will simultaneously mourn decline without celebrating growth. We have figured out how to do it, and it's like, man, I think that I feel like sometimes I'm taking crazy pills where I'm like, guys, we've designed the results that we're getting. We have kind of taught people what we say, hey, don't focus on the weekend attendance. Don't focus on the weekend attendance. I'm like, guys, I'm looking around. They got the message.
Right.
We're not.
Right.
But the problem is if we're right that weekend attendance is a lag measure for the other things that we want to see. A lead measure for the other things that we want to see. Then, man, the quickest way to kill a denomination is to tell them don't focus on the lead measure. Only talk about the lags. Any leadership will tell you, like, no, if you want to focus, if you want to see a lag measure result, you're a runner. You want to be able to run a marathon. You don't wake up every day and just think about marathons.
Yeah, you focus on the inputs.
Exactly. And the input is what we're getting at. And that's what this podcast is going to be about, is trying to take something that's been divorced, disciple making and church growth, put them back together where they belong, sending and church growth, put them back together where they belong, and then talk about all of those inputs. Because that's where the conversation, and man, the churches that are growing, they're already doing a lot of these inputs, but churches that aren't growing, a lot of them, I think, maybe don't know them.
Right. I'm going to kind of answer my question, but then, you can answer it too. Like, what sets us up to be good guides for people around this topic? So Pastor Andrew and I were both pastors before this at the Summit Church, when we were in seminary, before we started Mercy Hill Church around 12 years ago. And, I think a couple things I think that we could provide just in terms of value add for people. I know for me, when I was at the Summit Church, a lot of the kind of the things that people throw up about, like, growing churches, they're not concerned about, sending people, and they're not concerned of going deeper and all this stuff, and then you got these real discipleship oriented churches. One of the things that was helpful for me, we were in seminary, and the way that we heard about the Summit Church was we heard somebody speak, and they were talking about, sending missionaries to one of just the hardest places in the world. And we were a little shocked by that.
Right.
It had actually been a country in Central Asia that I had been to before, and so I knew how hard it was. And so hearing them talk about sending a whole team of people there, and business people there, and entrepreneurs, and all this awesome mission stuff, I was like, that's amazing. And then we went to the church, and the church is very, growth oriented and, inviter friendly, and tries to do everything they can to be welcoming. And so there wasn't this like, oh, we're super deep discipleship, or we're just super smoking lights growth. And so I got to see a little bit, like, there was no separation there. It was trying to grow the church, and we're trying to, challenge people to all sorts of really, really hard stuff just together, just not separated at all. And then we had the chance to start Mercy Hill, and our journey, and I'll let you talk more about that, but our journey we've seen, many of the stages of churches. And we moved here, we were 28 years old with 30 people, and, not much money, not, anything. And so we've got to go from that to, now seeing over 500 college students baptized, over 1,500 people baptized, many people sent out of our church to do things all around the world. And so we are not like the world experts by any means when it comes to like church growth. Many churches have grown much larger than us and seen all sorts of awesome stuff beyond us. But I do feel like, because we've seen it at all those different stages, and we know what it's like to have a small church and not much budget, and I think we could be helpful at just providing, hey, here's the stuff that's helped us. Maybe we can offer some of that to you guys.
Yeah, I think the question is, why would we be unique to the? I don't know, other than we do have a burden for this for other churches. I think all the ships are going to rise. I feel like, man, if churches can get it in their mind that focusing on first-time guest growth, website views, things about your parking lot, all the inputs, that we can end up with the lags that we want to see. But I will just speak plainly, Bobby. I feel like for us, my prayer when we planted Mercy Hill has really come to fruition. Now it's a bigger prayer, but this church grew from 30 to over 3,000 on the weekends. And I would say, from $150,000 yearly budget to $7 or $8 million budget, and I think people even get a little bit cringy when I'm willing to say that emphatically. But the reason that I'd be willing to share numbers like that is because for me, I look back and I say the number one thing that has helped us be able to send missionaries to the unreached and to plant churches, parent plant, not partner plant, parent plant churches, 5 of them, has been that we had our eye on growth.
Right.
And so if that's true for us, then how can I help but just say, man, we've got to speak more plainly and directly and not caveat a million things and not try to, I mean, most people would say, but it's not about the growth. It's like, well, now you ain't got to be big. But I mean, I think about Hepzibah, in Raleigh, this church in Raleigh, they're not a huge church, but they're planting churches. Why? Well, they're also thinking about first-time guests a lot, and there's a lot of churches like that. We just want to bring that conversation, I think, out into the open,
Right. So let's kind of maybe kind of get to the heart of it today in this episode 1, because I think once people are aware of what we're talking about, it becomes kind of crystal clear, and you could kind of see it all around you. But it may take a little bit for people to kind of trace with us exactly what we're talking about. So we're talking about today in episode 1, one barrier that church leaders can have is this guilt from the outside. And it ends up becoming internal, like where you feel, because you hear this in conferences and different places, you feel it's bad to desire for your church to grow. So let's talk about, because there could be some people that, well, is that just kind of a straw man? Like, do you have you, that really exists out there, that pastors actually feel bad?
Oh my gosh, yes.
So let's trace for us maybe over the last 10 years some examples of when we started realizing, man, this is a real thing that real people are dealing with that also are trying to plant churches, and but it's an actual thing. So let's just kind of maybe talk about some of those examples. I think it's going to help people realize, okay, I understand what you're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a dozen examples that come to my mind. I mean, I've got a few of them just kind of jotted down, but yeah, I mean, the earliest days at Mercy Hill, and it took me a while to kind of crack the code of what I was seeing. I just knew that something was off. So I would go, like, before we even planted, I would go to these gatherings of church planters and pastors that were in our area that we're in now in the Triad, different networks and whatever. And I would go, and I realized, like, man, the most of the churches were plateaued or declining. They were not growing. But the conversations that we were having were primarily conversations around how we shouldn't be focused, quote, just on the weekend numbers, or things like that, pejorative things like that are just kind of throwing shade at, like, the big mega church that's got the whatever. And it was like, man, these churches were not growing, but they were so committed to only growing one way. This was missional communities. This was only through one-on-one evangelism. You don't disciple people from a stage, all that stuff that I would just kind of sort of reject in a lot of ways. But I remember sitting there and I was just going like, man, that's when I first began to see it, is like, this is a real thing where the beliefs are bleeding into the results, Like, you really believe it's not about weekend numbers and therefore you don't have much. And it was, and I'm like, man, it seems like we would do better to sit in here and kind of talk about maybe like how to do a mailer strategy or phone calls to first-time guests, the right thing. But that's not what it was. It was most of the time philosophical stuff around, quote, the right way to grow, even though the churches weren't really growing. I'll give you another example. Another example was when I started getting into, our church started growing some, and I got invited into some different cohorts, and I mean, all around the country. It was awesome. And I'd come in and churches that are growing and all that, and these leaders, these missiologists would bring us in. Some of the guys I love.
Right.
It's like they would bring us in, but the message was always something like I heard one of the discipleship gurus that they had brought in to talk to us. And he said, like, man, this is his quote: if I'm just going to be around to help mega churches get bigger, I'm out. Instead of that, I'm devoting my life to making disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And I was like, that was one of the first times I heard it put so clearly, but I'm like, that is the new great missiological divorce.
Right.
It's this concept of,
and you're praised for it.
Yeah, well, you're praised for anti-church growth, but making disciples. And I'm like, man, for me, I remember sitting there because I'm just kind of a little bit like this. I was just kind of like, man, what do you think we're all trying to do? Like, what do you think we're trying to do? Like Jesus said, make disciples all the way to the ends of the earth. Like, what do you think we're trying to do? And, I've got a bunch of examples like that, man. We had one, I went to another thing down, our denomination kind of brought some guys in, all these big churches that are crushing it. They're baptizing people, first time guests. They're reaching their community. Many of them are planting churches. They're sending missionaries. And I realized within about 10 minutes, oh man, this is the missional talk. Like they have brought us in to kind of talk about how the operating system of our church is wrong. And it's like, it was very ironic for me because I'm like, man, you invited us because we're seeing success, but you're trying to convince us to do the things that churches that weren't invited here to do are doing, right? So it was like, man, that was a little bit ironic. The guy made a statement. He said, man, I'm just so tired of the church in America getting in the way of disciples being made. And that was about the point that I just about freaking lost it. I really wish I would have stood up right then and just kind of said like, hey man, this is the Alamo. Okay. Like I'm going to make my stand. Right? I didn't do that. I tried to be a little more, the Proverbs say, a fool makes his displeasure known at once. So I tried to, but man, I've got 1,000 examples of stuff like that where it's people that are saying the church growth is divorced. It's a different thing than the sending, than the mission, than the evangelism, than the discipleship, and they can't be held together. And then you end up seeing it all over, man. Like I just looked back on my seminary days and I thought, man, I got a 96-hour Master's of Divinity to prepare me for ministry, and I did not have one class about how to grow a church or what to do when your church does grow. And I love my seminary. I mean, Bob, you got 3 degrees from there. I mean, love it. Love the leadership. I'm like, this is coming from some type of philosophical, like I said, denominations will have a conference. You'll have 50 breakouts. Not one of them will be around this concept. And so to me, it's not a straw man. It's all over. We've had so many conversations with brothers who once they shake this free,
right,
man, it's like an awakening.
Right.
And so I think it's a real thing.
Yeah, I remember probably almost 10 years ago, the first time I kind of started getting around, like when you plant a church, at least for the first couple years, you're very much like in those, I mean, we plant churches now, but when you are a church planter, you're kind of in those church planting circles and aware of, other people that are planting churches in other places and talking to them and stuff. Yeah. And I remember, I think one of the things that's been very helpful for us, and this is just kind of a little bit been the spirit we've always had, is we're a Baptist church, and some people, like in our stream, they will only be around other people in their stream. And one of the things we've done is just be around other pastors. Mm-hmm. The kingdom's a big place, other pastors and other streams. And to me, that's always been very beneficial because you see some places where the bubble is kind of not like this. And I remember this maybe happened a couple different times, talking to a church planter we knew that, went to a city where you wouldn't historically think about, church growth and stuff. And, they had kind of bought into like what you're saying, mm-hmm. Almost like it's good that our church is not growing.
Yeah. It's like small non-growing is faithful.
Right. But they were also saying, and you hear this a lot with church planners, like, man, churches, you can't grow a church like this in this city.
Right.
Like you can't stand up on a stage like Acts 2 and just preach, in a way that's like engaging and compelling and expect mm-hmm. the church to grow. Well, the funny thing is I knew a guy in the same city that was in a different stream that he had kind of done that exact same thing, I mean, within a couple of years, it grew the church like 400. Mm-hmm. Really good, engaging, dynamic Acts 2 preaching, And the other guy over here is like, well, you just can't grow a church like that in this city, It's crazy. I mean, I've even noticed recently, I've heard some podcasts like really, really recently about this where, people that are like, believe the Bible, conservative people, they'll say, because they know preaching's important and they know like the word of God is the power to change people. You'll hear them even, they'll be talking about, discipleship now, and it's it's not stage. It's, we've moved beyond that. People in their faith have moved beyond that, and they'll have to even begin to kind of caveat and say, well, obviously we believe, preaching's important. And we believe,
Right.
but it's like they're having to go back and just make sure that they say, yeah, we know, preaching, can change people and all of that, but it's not about, it's really just about going deep. It's not about, and I just think that's like part of what we're talking about here. You just see it. You can see it in so many different places. I mean, we both probably have many examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest examples that came out where I think some of this breaking barriers stuff really began to click. You'll remember the story that I didn't know how to say the things that we're saying now, but I felt it deeply. And we were interviewing a guy that was going to be a church planter. Great dude. I mean, good dude, awesome family. Like, man, they're just, brother, But in the course of interviewing him about if he wanted to think about planting a church, I remember finally getting to I was asking a million different ways, and finally I had to ask him very, point blank. I said, brother, do you want your church to grow? And I think the question shocked him as much as it shocked me because...
What did he say?
Well, he squirmed. And that's the thing. That's when I began to really figure out, like, that's what we've got to figure out how to engage, is that when you ask somebody that question, that point blank, they don't have a very straightforward, emphatic yes of an answer. Instead, there's a squirm, there's a shifting of the feet, because here's the problem. It's like, man, the answer is yes, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Or the answer is no, and I certainly don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Like, how could it be like, no, I don't want my church to grow? But then when you say, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say I want my church to grow, So I think that really gets at the heart of it, that it's not just something out. Now, I'm not a professor. I can't track exactly, but man, I think we have put our finger on something, and I've seen it now enough times that I think we need to engage this. And without engaging it, and I think I should have said this earlier, without engaging it, man, I think our sending is going to be hurt, because churches, the tagline is churches can grow without going, but they cannot go without growing. It's a little bit like what you said earlier with, there's these stereotypes, I think one of the stereotypes is the big growing church doesn't want to plant because they're not missional. And it's like, man, you mentioned this with the summit. We were so blessed to see so much. Pastor JD and those guys, I mean, in practice, they hang this stuff together really well, like with growing and going. But I've realized now, like in our network, when I look around the denominational landscape, you ain't got to be huge. But if you're going to parent plant, not partner, not stick a sticker on a NASCAR, with your money and all. I'm talking about parent. There's no way to do that without being a growing church, that you're reaching people, you're baptizing people, you're replenishing, and you're sending out. So you could grow without going, but you can't go without growing.
I remember another instance for me where we started kind of realizing this was a real thing. You say anti-church growth movement, like
tyrannical.
It's big enough to kind of people get caught in the stream of this, where it's not just one person. It's like we were very, very lucky to come from a church that was growing, and so we had seen some of the stuff that it takes to grow a church. Obviously, it's all the biblical stuff. Like, none of the stuff is like rocket science. It's preaching the Bible, it's getting in community, it's challenging people. The Holy Spirit begins to kind of work through all that stuff. But I remember we moved to the Triad and we started getting in these different, like, they weren't cohorts, but it would just be a bunch of church planners coming together, more of a regional type thing, And we started going to these. And we were behind a lot of the other people because we were just planting, but we were lucky enough to come from a church that had been growing. And it's almost like people started to try to come up with strategies that were so anti-church growth that it was like, well, if your church could grow with this strategy, then it's like real growth, right?
Right.
I mean, stuff where we would hear and we'd be like, wait a minute. All right, you're canceling your Sunday gatherings and your church is going to gather on Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
And it was like, well, man, you gather on Tuesday afternoon, you're making disciples. Like this church growth is real. And I remember at the time we were just thinking, man, that don't seem right. It just don't seem like that's going to work, man. And here's the crazy thing. I mean, it's sad now because it's 12 years later.
Yeah.
Many of those churches and those leaders and those pastors, the churches don't exist anymore.
Right.
And it was like, but they were put up as like, these are the people we should be celebrating, the people that are doing the stuff that's like, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, used to be, it seems like that growing churches had platform to help other churches learn how to grow. And now it's like the growing churches a lot of times are the ones that are platformed to tell people not to try to grow. You know? I mean, you know,
What do you mean?
I don't mean like, well, I mean like I don't want to name names, okay? I was talking about you know, like I was, you know, you go to we were at a conference a couple years ago here in North Carolina, and it's like the messaging of the conference was don't focus on weekend attendance metrics, and COVID has shown us that that's not discipleship, which is a totally different conversation. I think we came out of COVID, many churches realizing they were doing pretty good at evangelism, not bad at discipleship. That's a totally different conversation. But it was so funny because I was sitting there watching and I'm going like, I mean, this guy is a guy that I would know the type of church he comes from. And I would say probably 95% of everything they do is oriented around church growth. Like I'm talking about weekend attendance, first-time guests, parking lot numbers, all of that. Because they've cracked the code of figuring out like, man, you got to have that if you want to go and send. But it's some of those, you know, some of those churches that are platformed, that are growing, that are kind of like, some ways the tip of the spear about telling people not to worry about it. And what happens is you end up at churches that aren't growing that are then also being told not to worry about it. And that's where I think that's why I look at it and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right.
Do you think like they've made the disconnect?
I think they've assumed it. They've just assumed, they assume it. Like, man, we're in a world that wants to focus so much on growth, 90s. So we're going to talk about sending missional disciple making. And they can do that in their own church because their church is focused on the growth aspect. But the messaging that gets out is don't focus on that. I mean, like the tagline right now, a conference coming up is, you know, what if your success was not measured by weekend attendance, but by disciple making? I mean, it's crazy pills. It's like, dude, one is a lead, the other is a lag. When you say things like that, you're taking churches that maybe aren't growing and then kind of not helping them with that, but actually layering on them guilt for even trying to think about it, you know? And so I think it just really does sort of a disservice, and it bears out in the numbers. So I can't remember, I don't have it right in front of me, but the Pew Research is like the Southern Baptist Convention has lost like 500,000 members in the last 3 or 4 years. But if you look, you see non-denominational stuff going wildfire. Mm-hmm. Well, why is that? Well, I mean, some of it, I think, is that you've kind of, you know, you've got other networks that are not doing what I'm talking about. That they're like, no, you want to try to grow any way you can. They have a high evangelism drive, you know, for like weekend preaching, and preaching still matters and that kind of stuff. And so, you know, I think that when you have that messaging of don't worry about the weekend, don't worry about numbers, don't worry about first-time guests, just don't even worry about that, just worry about disciple making, just does a real disservice unless you already have the back-end systems that are producing those things, and God's doing that in your church already. Yeah,
what's crazy to me, you're talking about some of these non-denominational churches and stuff, is you'll talk to people or you'll meet people that are sort of anti-growth, and you'll say, hey, have you heard of such and such church, or have you heard of such and such movement? And they'll be like, no, never heard of them. And I'm just always like, we could be so inward in the little group we're in. And to me, like I don't know, I just want us to have this sort of humility of like, to just look outside of our, you know, of our tribe and see that, man, there's churches doing some like really awesome stuff all around the country. You know, because that's one of the things that just like kills me about the whole conference circuit is like, you just have people stand up and they just kind of declare for the whole church in America that the church is losing, you know, the church is not discipling people, as if they are in the position like the Apostle John or something to like make a declaration about, you know, and I hope we don't do that, of like kind of declare, oh, the church in America, you know?
But man, I think, I mean, if we can follow the logic of this, it's like, I think some of what frustrates me about some of what you're talking about with the conference speak is that they lay the burden of blame, I think, a little bit on a straw man, because what it's constantly being said is, don't worry about all this stuff, you know, the church growth stuff's icky, you know, like don't worry about all that stuff. You're largely talking to an audience that has heard that message and bought into it.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So it's like, man, we continue to further decline, but we keep saying the problem is, you know, you're focused too much on the weekend attendance. And I'm like, well, is that the problem? Or is the problem that we're not focused enough on it? You know?
Right.
Is the problem that maybe we've kind of bought into some of this so much so that it's like, it's kind of really, you know, wrapping people up in terms of guilt and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I want us, like, you know, I think this is a good kind of stopping point for today to kind of wrap up, to help people really in this first episode just kind of understand what we're talking about. Many people may be listening, they don't know us, they don't know our church, they don't know what God has done. I think it may be worthwhile in like a future episode to help make the connection for people between your church growing and then seeing all the things that I know the majority of pastors are praying to see, the sending, church planning, you know, people's lives being changed, all that different stuff. Because I think people could just kind of hear us and just think, oh, you're just saying just grow your church to grow your church.
Right.
And so I think it'd be really worthwhile to connect all those dots. But I just want to say at the end of this one, like, I mean, we very much, for us, that they're totally just together.
Totally.
Like, grow the church to see all the amazing things that God will do happen when you set out to actually grow the church. So I think that'd be a good next couple episodes to try to make that connection for people, to help people to see that. Man, any sort of like final kind of wrap up or even what people could expect for, this is very much, these first couple episodes are very much an intro to just kind of this whole thing, but the types of things maybe people can expect from us.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think the first few episodes, we want to get into some of the philosophy of it, but I also know, because like what you said, I've got a lot of friends that are not sort of in our stream, and this whole episode is like, man, they would be like, nah, I don't buy into any of that. Like their stream doesn't do what we're talking about.
Right.
Like their stream is very much like pro,
trying to grow.
Yeah, where it's like, man, okay, we're making disciples. That a big part of that is like getting people here to hear the sermons on the weekend and great student ministry and groups.
And very spiritual people.
Highly.
I mean, praying, fasting.
Highly. So I would just say, like, man, if somebody is in more of that camp, what we are going to eventually get into here in the next few episodes is we want to just start talking about, you know, ways and practical tips and bring people in that are doing it. You know, we want to talk about baptizing more people. We want to talk about the ways to do those kind of things. So that stuff is coming. But as a cliffhanger for what you're saying, yeah, man, it's not growth. You know, 90s growth didn't talk about sending. Early 2000s, seeming like through the teens, we talk a lot about sending, missional disciple. We don't talk about growth. I don't think this is just kind of a knee-jerk reaction, a pendulum swinging back. It's really more just trying to hold these two things together. So you grow to go. We want to see disciples made all the way to the ends of the earth. It's the heartbeat of our church. Man, we have a huge goal, 2032, 500 missionaries sent out. We always pair that with the 5,000 baptisms that we need to see in order to see those 500 missionaries go out. And one of them is not more exciting than the other. Just like resurrection is not more exciting than Christmas. I mean, is it more important? Maybe. It doesn't happen without, if we don't hit the 5,000 baptisms, it's going to be hard to hit the 500 missionaries. We could talk about that next time.
Yeah, so I would encourage everybody to obviously subscribe to the podcast. We're going to continue to put out weekly episodes. You know, one of the, I don't know if it's a promise, but one of the things I know that we're really going to try to do, a lot of times conference circuit podcasts, they just kind of talk about controversial stuff and get people riled up and just kind of leave it at that without any like very, very value add practical stuff for people. And I just really want to make the commitment. We are going to try to really provide real value add stuff to people. We're just kind of setting it up today, but in the future, I mean, a lot of just very practical stuff that we've done that, man, we're just going to totally share. And here are some of the systems and processes and things that we've done that God has blessed in like a super unique way, and just be able to share that with people. So I just say that to say, man, keep listening, share this with a friend, share this with a ministry, friend, and can't wait to see you guys back here.
Perfect.